Hi, can everyone hear me? All right, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming today. My name is Jennifer Jett. I'm an editor at the New York Times and first vice president at the FCC. Thank you for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please silence your phones, but feel free to tweet as much as you want. We're at FCCHK. And I also want to tell you about some upcoming events. We have a lot going on the next couple of weeks. Starting tomorrow, we have a club lunch featuring Dilip Sinha, India's former ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, and he'll be talking about the current state of the UN Security Council. Saturday is our 4th annual journalism conference. We still have a few tickets left for that. If you'd like to join, that's a day-long event with a wide range of speakers coming from all over the world and a lot of interesting workshops as well. And then next week, on Monday night, we have on Monday and Tuesday, we have a couple of events related to Art Basel. On Monday night, you are welcome to join us in the main bar with cocktails with visiting artists who are in town for Art Basel. And then on Tuesday, we have a club lunch related to Art Basel, featuring experts on Hong Kong's role in the global art scene, with a focus on contemporary African art. Two more, really quickly. Tuesday night, we're hosting a screening of the documentary Abacus, Small Enough to Jail, which was an Academy Award nominee last year. That's about a family-owned bank in New York's Chinatown that was the only U.S. bank to be prosecuted after the 2008 financial crisis. It's really good. And then, if all that isn't enough, on Wednesday night we have a dinner featuring Alan Rusbridger, who is the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. So please do go on the website, go online, look up the details, and sign up for these events if you're interested. Today we're talking about press freedom both in China and also how China is influencing press freedom in other countries around the world. I'll briefly introduce our speakers. First, we have Yuan Yang, who is Vice President of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China in Beijing. That is the Professional Association of Foreign Journalists reporting out of Beijing. Yuan is also the Beijing correspondent for the Financial Times covering technology. Next, we have Josh Chin, who is treasurer of the FCCC in Beijing, and he is a reporter. He reports on Chinese politics and technology for the Wall Street Journal in Beijing and Hong Kong. And finally, we have Cedric Alviani, who is the East Asia Bureau Director for the press freedom watchdog Reporters Without Borders. He opened their Asia office in Taipei in 2017. Okay, so we're here today to talk about two reports. One that the FCCC put out a couple of months ago about working conditions for journalists working in China, and a second report that Cedric is releasing on Monday, which is about how China is influencing the media overseas. So let's start with the FCCC report. Can you guys tell me a bit about how long you've been putting this report together, why, and how you go about it?
I can take that. So we've been doing this report sort of in its current form since since 2010, I believe. We did another report kind of starting in 2007 to 2009 ahead of the Olympics, but it was a very different kind of thing, so not really comparable to what we do now. But so for this report, in the past we've had sort of separate working conditions reports and visa reports, and recently we've just sort of combined them for simplicity's sake. But generally we have around 200 correspondent members currently in our club, and we sort of send the survey out electronically to everyone, and then harass them repeatedly to get them to fill it out. I mean, I think it speaks to the environment in China that I think a lot of reporters who've been there for a long time, that you have to kind of ride them to do this because they've sort of gotten used to the sort of the harassment and the limitations that they deal with. They don't necessarily see them as extraordinary, so you kind of have to remind them that it's not normal, and get them to fill out the survey. And then, so in addition to that, we then talk to bureau chiefs of some of the larger organizations to just get the sort of the management view, because the bureau chiefs are they're dealing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their own and researchers and that sort of stuff. So they have a bit of a different view, and that's kind of basically how it goes.
And what's the reasoning behind the report? Why does the FCC think it's important to put together, and what sort of trends have you seen generally in the report in the last few years?
Right. So, generally we put together a report because, like I said, the original sort of proto-survey started ahead of the Olympics. And I think the idea then was in part to sort of pressure the government into relaxing a lot of the reporting restrictions that existed in China before the Olympics. And they were actually quite stringent. Before the Olympics, you had to sort of, if you were a foreign correspondent, you wanted to go anywhere outside of your home city, you had to apply for permission. And then you would go to a place and you'd sort of be taken around by the local office, the local sort of propaganda office, and they would basically babysit you wherever you went and kind of interfere with your interviews. And so this is part of a general pressure campaign we put on the foreign ministry, which also included sort of lobbying the International Olympic Committee, and that eventually worked, and they did. They came out right before the Olympics with this whole new set of rule changes that really opened up the environment. And so because of that early success, we just kept doing it, and it's a way to sort of highlight, how changes are happening. It's also a way for us to sort of start a conversation with the foreign ministry, because they're sort of less and less willing to talk to us. Our club is technically not legal. And that we have no status. We're not allowed to have status there. So they're reluctant to address us as a club. And doing this survey sort of forces them to contend with us a little bit, especially when it gets good media coverage. And it's also just for our own members, so they kind of know, just to remind them, again, that what they're dealing with is not normal, and to sort of alert people to different kinds of problems that other correspondents are experiencing. And trend-wise, the really, I think, interesting thing is that it's actually fairly consistent. The headline number, we sort of always ask whether people think conditions are getting better or worse. And it's fairly consistent. It's been fairly consistent throughout the last sort of 10 years. What's really remarkable about this year is that we had 56% of a majority of correspondents, 56% said the conditions had gotten worse, which is the worst result, or the highest number, since 2011. And 2011, some of you who've been around for a while might remember there was a year where there was the Jasmine Revolution, which was this was when the Arab Spring was happening, and the Communist Party was really afraid of that something similar might happen in China, and there were some protests that broke out, and the government really clamped down. And that was by far the worst year that we've had for the survey. So this year was the worst since then.
Yuan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add for the record that although our club has no legal status, arguably that does not make it an illegal organization. Just two things, especially from the perspective of somebody as myself who came to China 3 years ago. So I was in the UK before then and came to Beijing 3 years ago with the FT. I think a report like the Working Conditions Report is really important for new correspondents coming into China, of which there are more and more as the role of China and China's market grows in the eyes of the world. Because often when you meet your first few instances of harassment or denial of access, you're not entirely sure whether this is just about you or about the topic, about the news organization, or how widespread the issue is. And even reading the kinds of responses that we got into this report while we were compiling it, it really opened my eyes as to the breadth and scope of the kind of surveillance and harassment that my peers in Beijing have gone through. And without such a kind of collective awareness-raising exercise, many of us may not know what it is really like to report in China. So I think that's one important thing. The second is that there's an asymmetry about the information collection we do because of the trust we have with our correspondent members in Beijing. They can tell us, sometimes anonymously or sometimes on the record, what has happened to them over the course of last year to hinder their reporting. But when we present this to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's of course no corresponding report that they produce, of all the ways in which Chinese authorities have harassed or intimidated reporters in China, or at least if that report exists, it's certainly not for external consumption. And so being able to produce at least our experience pretty objectively, as foreign reporters, puts on the record something that otherwise would never be on the record.
You said, according to the reporters who answered the survey, last year was the worst for working conditions in China since 2011. Could you guys give some examples of what exactly happened to reporters working in China, and also why do you think last year was so much worse? What was the motivation behind that?
So there are three themes I'd like to highlight in terms of trends that have become worse. Government surveillance, secondly, pressure on Chinese nationals working in foreign media, and then Josh will also say something about Xinjiang, which so firstly, government surveillance has intensified. Surveillance has always been an issue, from day one for foreign correspondents in China. There are still very simple forms of human surveillance that our reporters experience. So in the report, we found that nearly half of correspondents experienced human surveillance. An example of that would just be a police officer following you around the town that you're trying to report on when you're in the field, or as we've commonly seen, also people breaking into hotel rooms, officers breaking into hotel rooms, or even in some situations, correspondents arriving back at their hotel to find that their room has been rifled through, or that there are police standing at the entrance. So those kinds of surveillance, are low tech, are very easy to do, especially with the number of police employed by China, and have been going on for a long time. But we've also seen two different things happening. One is an increasing precision of surveillance because of the capacities of technology, especially facial recognition technology that exists now. So in the report, we found that 22% of respondents said they were aware of authorities having tracked them down using public surveillance systems. One example is a colleague who went to Xinjiang, was told by police, was tracked down over several thousand kilometers of road he was driving, and he was told that tracking was possible because of the vehicle license plate recognition systems that are now in place in Xinjiang. You can actually read a first-person account of that in the Globe and Mail by Nathan van der Klip. So this is a kind of intensification of the possibilities of surveillance made through the improvement of visual recognition technologies. And the second part of that is also, I think, the broadening scope of what can be surveilled. In the last 4 or 5 years, as WeChat, which is a social media messaging platform owned by Tencent, WeChat has become more and more prominent in people's daily lives. It's almost impossible to organize the social event without having to send somebody a WeChat event. If it's not on WeChat, it doesn't exist, is the thought. Maybe similar to the way that Facebook or WhatsApp is used here. And the government does not easily distinguish between your private life and your professional life when it conducts such surveillance. So in the report, there's an account of a correspondent who had her telephone calls with her primary school-aged son played back to her, and of course that was not her doing work. That was the impingement of surveillance into her personal life. And for myself, I've been told by my visa handler, so when you renew your visa every year in Beijing, you have to go to the immigration bureau where police officers will interview you each year. Usually it's very kind of very brief. And a couple of years ago, they asked me about a social event that I had organized via WeChat invites, which was not to do with my professional work either. So these are examples of the scope and intensity of surveillance expanding. Briefly on assistance, in the mainland, Chinese nationals are not allowed to work as journalists in foreign media. And so there are many very talented Chinese nationals who are working as producers or cameramen or researchers in foreign media, who foreign correspondents, especially those who are not fluent in Mandarin, depend very highly on those Chinese nationals. And I think we've seen in the last year also an intensification of harassment from the police to both Chinese nationals and also Chinese nationals working in the media and Chinese sources outside of the media. Examples include intimidation of Chinese nationals who work in foreign media's family, friends, and making threats about what could happen to their relatives if they would continue to do the reporting that they do. And speaking as a foreign national in China, as you can probably guess, I'm from the UK. It's very easy, relatively easy for us to get a flight and leave if harassment intensifies. But the Chinese nationals who live in the mainland, have families in the mainland, are the most at threat. And so this is a very, very worrying trend that we're seeing. So Josh is going to talk a little bit about Xinjiang.
I'll try to make this brief, but I'm sure many of you have been following the news about Xinjiang over the past couple of years. For those of you who haven't, really quickly, I mean, the Communist Party is sort of rolled out a really kind of unprecedented combination of surveillance and mass detention in Xinjiang, which is in the northwest of China, and it's aimed at the local sort of mostly Muslim Turkic minorities there. I mean, it's really sort of quite shocking thing to see. But so this is naturally, a lot of people have gone out to report on what's happening there. And it's a situation where the surveillance that, as Yuan already sort of indicated, the surveillance that's being used on the local minorities is also very easily turned on reporters. So we've had, I think we had in the survey, 24 people reported, 24 correspondents reported having reported in Xinjiang last year. Of those, 96% of them were visibly followed, so basically 100%. 80% of them were asked or forced to delete data. And then 60% more, a majority had interviews visibly monitored, and a majority also were detained or had a colleague detained. And then several had their rooms entered and had, were denied hotels in some cases, which is sort of patently absurd. You have people who, reporters would sort of come into a town and have a hotel reservation, show up, and the hotel would be like, "Oh, sorry, we're full." And then they go to from hotel to hotel, and every hotel in this town is mysteriously full, in the middle of a down tourist season. And so, in one case, some reporters basically had to spend the night in a lobby, and were sort of watched by police the entire time. So it's quite intense, and what's becoming sort of the norm now is in the past. If you had problems where local officials were sort of violating the rules, right, basically trying to deny you access that you were sort of legally allowed to have to public areas or whatnot, you could for time around the Olympics anyway, you could call the foreign ministry and say, "Hey, these local officials are messing with me," set them straight, and that would work to one degree or another. And in Xinjiang, what you realize is that they have virtually no power. So, in several instances, I've been detained, in some cases for several hours there, and you call the foreign ministry, and they just, their handler kind of lets out a sigh, and he's like, "Oh, let's see what I can do," and it's usually nothing. So basically, it's the most sort of, it's one of the biggest stories, I mean, I think personally in the world, going on right now, and the harassment there is quite intense.
So we've heard about how journalists' work is being interfered with in China. Now I want to turn it over to Cedric, who's going to talk about who's put a lot of work into a report that he's releasing soon about how other countries are trying to emulate these practices.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. But you see on the screen that TV anchor, he's not real. He's actually, he was introduced by Xinhua News Agency at the past Internet World Conference in Wuzhen. He's the first digital virtual TV anchor, and that's what China is presenting as the future of journalism. Yeah. This is funny, but it's also somehow scary. Yes. It shows that to the current Chinese authorities, and President Xi Jinping stated it very clearly and repeatedly, journalism, as we know it, does not have its place in China. And actually, currently the Chinese authorities are also trying, little by little, to suppress free journalism outside China, when, of course, it relates to Chinese news. If we had met 10 years ago, the purpose would have been, as an NGO, how can we improve the situation in China? Now the question is, how can we protect democracies from the activities of China in this domain? this goes back to the Olympics. We all know that China was expecting the Olympic Games of 2008 to be some kind of a showcase of economic development of China, but it was also used by the opponents, especially like human rights defenders, as a showcase too. After that, the Chinese authorities considered that they had to enter what they call media war. They had to boost their media, to boost their capacity to change the narrative of the media worldwide. And this is what has happened 10 years later. China always introduces itself as a regime that is pacific, that is trying to work for a win-win situation with other countries. But actually, when we're talking about media, we hear a much more paranoid description of the international relationship, where the Western powers would be upset about the Chinese success and would use their media as a tool to try and destroy China, to try and destroy its image. So back in 2011, the president of Xinhua News Agency actually theorized this idea of creating a new world media order that would be, of course, pushed or run by China. This was in an editorial piece, I think, in the Wall Street Journal. And actually, almost 10 years later, well, the Chinese authorities have done it. The success is beyond expectation. You will have all details in the report, which is 52 pages. It's been a lot of work. How did they do? First, the Chinese authorities have put a lot of money in order to boost their media. It is said that they might spend 10 billion US a year to manipulate or try and modify the perception of China in the media in the world. This is twice what the USA are spending, for example, for their public relations. The Chinese media have totally changed. People used to laugh about Xinhua Agency. That looked very patriotic, very kind of a funny old school style, but now it's not the case. If you download the app of Xinhua News Agency on your cell phone, you will see that it actually looks like similar to another big press agency. If you go and watch CCTV Africa or now the CCTV Europe that is opening, you are going to see African TV hosts, European TV hosts, a very sophisticated image, a very good general quality. So China has made a lot of efforts to improve this communication. But of course, it's never, when you say your country is good, it's never as good as when other people say it. So there are other ways for the Chinese authorities to try and manipulate the media around the world. One very cunning way is the use of a supplement called China Watch. I don't know if some of you know what it is, but it's basically a supplement that is being carried by legitimate famous media in the world. And there's a long list, and basically the biggest media in the world have done it in the past, including, if I don't mistake, Washington Post, including New York Times, including Financial Times, I think. No, not Wall Street Journal, yes, absolutely. So this is something that is very dangerous, because even though it's written somewhere that it is a public redactional supplement, when you're subscribing to the Wall Street Journal and you read it, you don't necessarily pay attention to that little detail. So this is very dangerous. China has also massively taken stakes in the media all around the world, and some journalists have discovered when they got fired after writing a column on China that there was a Chinese stakeholder in their media. And also the Chinese language media overseas that used to be quite critical to the Chinese regime are now most of them have been purchased and have been integrated to the Chinese global propaganda system. That's not all. China has created its own events to promote its own vision of internet. And actually the Wuzhen conference, the World Internet Conference, is a good example. The big heads of the social media have been there until this year, when they realized that it might not be so wise to show their face at an event in which obviously China is promoting a restricted, closed concept of internet. So there have been a lot of ways. Of course, China is also using its software, and I suppose if you have WeChat, you have to be careful with what you write, who you communicate with. When you use WeChat, there have been tries to export some versions of Baidu in some countries, including Japan, including Brazil. And of course, the version was censored. And last, China is exporting its regulation, especially in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand are copying the model of internet regulation offered by China. It's almost like photocopies of the same regulation. You imagine, very repressive. It's a blessing for dictators. Last, and you will have details in the report, we describe how China is using some pressure and violent methods. You have the famous example of the ambassadors, who now, the Chinese ambassadors, do not hesitate to be extremely vocal and extremely aggressive. You have recently the example in Sweden, where the ambassador is attacking every media every time that they report something on China that he doesn't like. You have the Confucius Institutes, and as a matter of fact, now more than 10 of them have been closed after the universities realized that they were used by China to make some lobbying in the university. Threats, physical attacks, blackmail on every company, every media company on earth, that's happening all around the world. So how to resist? That's a big problem, because democracies are open. They are open to media, and actually the Chinese authorities are using that dissymmetry, that fact that the democracies have to provide space. So far, the best answers have not come from the governments, but they have come from the civil society. I would like to mention two examples. One is how NGOs and the employees of Google have managed to stop that project of a censored search engine that Google was preparing to re-enter China. Another example is in the UK, some former prisoners of China who were shown on the public TV, who were forced to confess their alleged crimes, are suing CCTV. They are asking the regulation authority to cancel the license of CCTV on the ground that these channels are showing illegal contents. So these are interesting answers. Yes, so that's it. It's a chilling report, especially because it's based only on facts that are already available in the media. We haven't done a specific investigation, but we expect that it's going to encourage journalists all around the world to investigate in their region, in their country, in their city, to see what the Chinese authorities are doing, because most of the times you discover it when it's too late. And of course, we expect democracies to take that problem seriously, so that for the next generation, journalism would still be journalism as we know it, and not propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I can't wait to see that report. I wanted to ask Josh and Yuan about that, because you said, Cedric, you said 10 years ago the idea was how to promote democratic media practices in China, and now it's more how to prevent China's media practices from spreading. Would you guys agree with that? Do you see the media environment in China changing under any circumstances, or is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the media environment in China is unrecognizable from 10 years ago. I mean, obviously, China's never had free media, but for a period of time, there were several, I mean, at least maybe as many as a dozen sort of commercially run news organizations in China that they were able to push the boundaries and kind of walk right up to the red lines, and were quite good In Guangzhou, just across the border, there was the Southern Weekend, which did really, really great investigative work. In Beijing, you had a couple newspapers, and they are basically now either shut down or completely neutered, basically. Xi Jinping came out, I can't even remember when this was, a couple years ago, and did a tour of all the main state media, central state media, CCTV and Xinhua, and gave this speech about how, which is sort of it was reminiscent almost of Mao, talking about how media needed to serve the party, and it was surnamed party, right? It was this really kind of odd phrase, but I think that was a signal, and since then, the space for any kind of independent media in China is almost non-existent.
Yeah. Just one point about the media climate in China, and then another point about Cedric's point about China Watch and exporting Chinese supplements abroad. So within China, I would also add in the opposite direction that as China's economy is slowly opening to the world, that the role of business media, both local and foreign business media in China, has increased. There's much more demand for business news, and I think to some extent the Chinese government recognizes that there can only really be trade, joint ventures and so on if the foreign partners in those joint ventures can get accurate and timely news about business out of China. And in terms of the domestic censorship climate, of course, the biggest investigative media outlets that Josh has mentioned have in many ways been crippled by censorship and by government threats over the last few years. There's also an interesting blossoming of self-published media, zimeti, on social media platforms, which can be quite niche. They can do quite niche investigative work. There's been some doing very interesting investigations into, for example, data privacy, which has become a recent big topic in China. And the funding models for the zimeti is also shaky, and of course they cannot reach the kind of scale of the formal commercial news organizations. And if they were to reach that scale, then they would become under much greater pressure. But there is still a lot of very creative, exploratory journalism done by freelance or kind of unofficial, self-made bloggers and journalists in China, many of whom who are former journalists who were laid off from their actual investigative outlets. So that is a bright spot, a small bright spot on the horizon. Secondly, on Cedric's point about Chinese supplements in foreign media, I mean, we've seen, in the same, you might open the Washington Post in the same page that you see an editorial about Xinjiang and abuses in Xinjiang. On the opposite page, you might see the China Watch supplement, and it's very much a clash. And the reason behind that is obviously not that any of these outlets particularly want to promote, I presume, that they want to promote China Watch, or which is a branch of the People's Daily, abroad, but because of the lack of funding going into traditional media organizations, even though that the Washington Post and New York Times and so on have increased their subscriber base over the last few years, the advertising revenues going into the media industry as a whole has plummeted because, as we all know, of the rise of ad tech giants like Google and Facebook, and that is the terminal issue here. The terminal issue here is funding.
Actually, I would just add really quickly to that. I mean, I think one of the really interesting themes you see now, speaking to Cedric's topic, is because Chinese news organizations are so flush with cash, and this is not totally new, but you've definitely seen it much more now. You have these waves of journalists being laid off in the West, and a huge number of them are ending up at Chinese state media news organizations, it's helping them sort of professionalize their look and the feel of their news to a degree that they haven't been able to in the past.
I want to open it up for questions. Any questions from the audience? Jody? Oh, and please introduce yourselves and your organization.
Hi, I'm Jody Schneider. I'm an editor with Bloomberg News here in Hong Kong and member of the Board of Governors here. This is all giving us great pause and lots to think about. One thing that I don't know if this is in the report or not, but I'd like to hear, and particularly what the journalists think about this, is what this obviously is focused, and your talk is focused on what reporters face. What about the sources? I don't know whether that's in the report, but obviously this has been, of great concern to a lot of journalists, even if they're not going to be harassed for a particular story, what could happen to their sources, many of whom are local. And I assume it's not good. And are there ways to get around it? I assume your organization, the FCCC, deals with this?
I think that's a really good question, because ensuring the safety of your sources to a reasonable standard is the prerequisite for all reporting that we do in China. And in the same way that we've seen pressure on Chinese nationals who are working in foreign media increase, I think the pressure on Chinese nationals who are sources has also increased, especially in the Xinjiang region. One of the respondents to the survey said that in many situations, especially in Xinjiang, they didn't even try to conduct interviews in the first place because they knew that if they were to do so, that would severely endanger anybody that they would even just witnessed having a conversation with, be it, a receptionist, in a convenience shop, to somebody on the street that they were trying to actually interview. And that severely limits access, of course, but also limits reporters' considerations of what they could potentially report on. I think in the past year, just speaking personally, I've also seen, as a reporter, you have, when you're reporting, you have a certain threat model in your mind, a kind of vague threat model of what the kinds of forms of interference or attack you might receive from different levels of the government, depending on the different kinds of activities you're doing. And I imagine many reporters also would categorize just mentally for themselves their different sources into, say, sensitive sources who are known political distance, maybe with a known criminal record in China, all the way down to the least sensitive sources, which probably would be economics analysts and investment banks giving you quotes about GDP growth, say. And all along that spectrum, I've seen a shifting of sensitivity and escalation of threat, such that even in some cases, academic economists working for reputable universities in China have said, no, we can't really comment on the record on the economy right now, and that's become a sensitive issue. So I think what's particularly alarming, personally as a journalist in China, is that although I can, to some degree, prepare my sources who I've classified as sensitive, communicating with them in different ways and so on, taking precautions. Many times I feel like I'm caught out by the escalation of sensitivity on sources that I would not consider at all sensitive.
I think she covered it.
Steve?
You mentioned sorry, I'm Steve Hines. You mentioned that there's a slight chink of light with these microblogs walking away from the official media, but I'm just wondering in general, whether you have an awareness of how far the Great Firewall has stopped people gaining access to information both from inside and outside China, because obviously if they can gain access from outside, there's a wealth of information.
It's funny that you bring this point up, because yesterday I was actually present at the talk where James Griffiths, the CNN correspondent, was talking about his new book, The Great Firewall of China, which I would strongly recommend. I think that it's easy for English speakers, like all of us in this room, to think of the firewall as limiting information in that Chinese citizens can't access English language media abroad. In fact, if we think about how many of us access Chinese language media in China, then we start to see that the limitation is often not just the technological censorship apparatus, but also the fact that people tend not to read media outside of just their cultural bubble, and especially their linguistic bubble. I would say the firewall, the firewall in terms of the censorship apparatus that filters internet traffic coming in and out of China to the rest of the world is perhaps not as great interference in people's lives compared to the internal media controls domestically in China. So, for example, in the last couple of years, we've seen huge sweeping crackdowns on social media in China. There used to be a saying that Weibo, which is the Twitter equivalent microblogging site in China, in fact, the biggest microblogging platform in the world by users, in the early 2010s, in the kind of early days of Weibo, it used to be a place where people could express political views and views about politics, about the economy, debate about issues, and also, of course, talk about entertainment and soap operas and things that people just like to talk about on social media. And then in the next few years, the politics went, then the economics went, and even in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of the entertainment media outlets on Weibo being shut down. So there was a saying that there's no journalism in China apart from entertainment journalism, and when that's gone, what do we have left on Weibo?
I was just going to add, I mean, on the technical side, with the Great Firewall, I think it was always a small number of people who had VPNs, virtual private networks, and other ways of circumventing the wall. But the idea used to be that if you were determined enough, you could get away, you could get around it if you were Chinese. And I think that's actually less and less true, and that's partly because there's new laws that, they're a little bit unclear, but that essentially criminalize VPNs, and there've been at least, I think there's at least one example that's come out publicly, but probably are others that I'm not aware of someone being fined, I think like 5,000 RMB, which is not a small amount of money for a lot of people for having a VPN. So even now, if you know how to get around it and you want to get around it, you could be breaking the law. So.
Yes.
I'm Emily Lau of the Democratic Party and a former member of the Legislative Council. And I'm also on the board of directors of the China Human Rights Lawyers Concern Group. I think the situation that you've told us is very, very worrying. And of course, we in Hong Kong, it may soon come to Hong Kong, and then situation like this we have today will not be allowed to take place. Can you tell me what do the owners of the news organizations like the FT and the Wall Street Journal and so on, and they certainly know about the problems faced by their work reporters in mainland. What do the employers do to support the journalists, or nothing at all? And also, does this mean that less and less journalists would want to go to mainland China to do reporting? Thank you.
So I think there are two main things that news organizations can do for their journalists. And one, speaking as a Financial Times reporter, I'm very lucky to be in a news organization where there's been decades of coverage of China, and therefore old China hands, as we'd call them, who have experienced China, in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, and whom I can ask for advice. There's a collegiate atmosphere within my organization where I can tell them, this is what's going on with me. How does this sound to you? Is this okay? Kind of sanity checking the situation. And so drawing on the older correspondents in your organization is very important, creating peer mentorship networks such that new, less experienced journalists can experience that kind of support and help from older, more experienced China reporters is really important. The second thing I think news organizations should do, and just based on my experience as a tech reporter and somebody who's very interested in digital security, I think it's paramount that news organizations shift the way that they think about information security and operational security in the 21st century. Many of our news organizations were set up at times when there were only print editions. Journalists would fax in their copy once a day, or deliver it by snail mail. And there are people in my own organization who came into the FT in the 90s who've seen huge shifts in the way that we use the internet. I think it really is time for all news organizations to catch up to digital security. I think, judging from the just my friends in the FCC in Beijing and talking to friends about what support they give them, the organizations give them on digital security, I think this is severely lacking in most news organizations for many different reasons, but partly because it's a resource issue, that if you're really going to train up your journalists and their editors and all their colleagues on digital security, if you're really going to invest in a cybersecurity team who could give support, give trainings, even penetration test the networks of your foreign bureaus, which I think is a very good idea. That all takes time and money to do, and I'm glad that the FT is now starting to do many of those things, but I think that we are not abnormal in the media industry for being slow to the party to do these things.
I agree wholeheartedly with all of that. I think the other thing news organizations can do and or need to do is to sort of figure out ways to resist Chinese government pressure, because the government is very expert at putting pressure on large organizations, especially those with commercial interests in China. thankfully, in some ways for my newspaper, they've blocked our Chinese website, which removed a large revenue source for us in China, so we probably are less subject to that kind of pressure, but there are other news organizations that do have significant commercial interests in China, and I think what news organizations need to do is to think about long-term what is more valuable to them as news organizations, their interest in China or their reputations for covering China fairly and objectively. And so, thankfully, I think the journal has done a very good job of backing us up if we've been if we've been detained in sort of exerting pressure, threatening to exert pressure on the Chinese government even in New York or in Washington D.C. in order to protect us. And I think that's something that probably all news organizations need to think about quite carefully.
Go ahead.
Hi. Excuse me, Ilaria Maria Sala freelance. I have a question for both of you regarding precisely your Chinese language websites. I was wondering, when we are talking about you just mentioned on how already there are few Chinese internet users who have VPN, but even those who have, they're not so likely to go and check news in a language that is not Chinese. Even in the case of a blocked website like the Wall Street Journal, or I think the FT is not blocked, am I wrong? It's still accessible, right? So how useful is that, you think, in kind of managing to transmit some different versions of the same stories that, because of the language, could be more interesting for Chinese users? And is increasing translation, like I don't know if the Reporters Without Borders report is translated into Chinese, but how much is translation a possibility to kind of try to break this asymmetry?
So just speaking about FT Chinese, which is, as you say, a Chinese media outlet that is still, touch wood, not blocked in the mainland. I think we're actually the last remaining Chinese version of a foreign newspaper not blocked in the mainland. So that's been protected for many different reasons, one of which is that the FT Chinese is entirely separate to the FT. We're in different offices, we don't have any control of what they do, and vice versa. The FT Chinese often translates news that we write into Chinese for a Chinese audience, which means most of our China reporting is translated if it's deemed kind of newsworthy for a China audience. Some of our other foreign reporting is also translated if it's of interest to Chinese readers. But I think that the importance of that has been, I felt very greatly as a correspondent who travels quite a lot around different provinces in China and second and third tier cities in China, not just Beijing, Shanghai, and the big metropolis. When I'm in second or third tier cities, if I say that I'm from the Financial Times, most people will recognize the FT Chinese as a brand more than the Financial Times, because they probably don't read English language media or wouldn't consider reading English language media, and because a lot of that some of the writing there is done by our FT Chinese writers or columnists for FT Chinese. Some of it is done in translation from our foreign correspondents. You get quite an interesting mix, both of kind of local Chinese views on Chinese news and then kind of foreign correspondents' news. And I think certainly, middle-class Chinese readers do want alternatives to a rapidly shrinking media landscape.
Yeah, I agree. I was to say, personally as a reporter, I really miss not having our website available in China, because in some ways it almost made me feel like a local reporter, right? Because you would have these people responding to your stories, and these are people who sort of have they have a stake in your story, right? Which is very different from an American reader reading something about China. So I do miss that. I think there's a huge hunger for translation. I don't know what our reader numbers are on our Chinese website, which still exists, but we continue to translate. We continue to put stuff out. We have a WeChat channel. We have Weibo accounts. We still continue to put that out, and I think there's definitely a hunger, but it's very hard to sort of, because our website is shut down now, we don't have access to the data, and it's really hard to sort of understand exactly what the impact is. And China has made it very difficult for that to be commercially viable. So hopefully it continues.
Cedric, did you have anything to add about translation?
Yes, yes. Our report will be available in Chinese, both simplified and traditional Chinese, in addition to French and English. It will be on our RSF website, available for download starting Monday lunchtime, 1 p.m. exactly. But if some of you want to report on it or have a special interest, please make sure you leave your name card. We can provide embargoed copies starting tomorrow. So please just make sure I know and make sure you get it. Thank you.
Just an additional point on information transfer in and out of China, although not in the Chinese language. I'm sure that many of you who've lived in mainland China and have many Chinese friends will experience the strange phenomenon of being asked to be almost like an internet librarian. So, for example, academics sometimes ask me, "Oh, can you get me this PDF of this New York Times article?" Or, I can't find this thing on Baidu. Would you mind looking on Google for me? And so I feel like we also play a kind of quite important role, which is to be a kind of transfer of information into China. Of course, the more Chinese language media there is out there, then the better for those readers.
I think we had one last question over here.
Hi, I'm Tohan Shi, a senior reporter at Finance Asia. I have one question for Yuan Yang. In the past, Financial Times was given high respect by the Chinese government, and Chinese Prime Minister Wen Xiaobao gave exclusive interviews to Financial Times. How does Financial Times now stand with the Chinese leaders? And then I have another question for Cedric. I mean, the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which is a very conservative right-wing newspaper, has there been a lot of Chinese sponsorship or advertisement or investments in the Daily Telegraph? Has that influenced the Daily Telegraph to be nicer to China in its coverage? And are similar things happening in other European newspapers? Can you give specific examples?
So to your first question, I mean, as I mentioned, I've been in China with the FT for 3 years, and I think I was a teenager when Wen Jiabao was in power, so I can't really give you a lot of insight into the historical relationship between the FT and previous Chinese leaders. But I think, as with many news publications, I think it's important to listen openly to the concerns that Chinese authorities have in our reporting, and we do that both in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in London with the Chinese embassy there, and to think of the fact that you are in China, in the territory of this government, as a two-way relationship. You can't just say, we're going to come into China, we're going to do things our own way. That would not get you anywhere. So I think the FT has always been historically pretty good at maintaining a two-way relationship. You have to listen to the criticism. You don't necessarily have to agree with the criticism, but you at least have to leave an opening for the criticism to be voiced and to consider it, because sometimes the other side has a point about our writing, and it's important to listen while also maintaining your red lines in terms of your journalistic principles. So I think that overall is the right framework for dealing with the Chinese government as a media organization.
Yes, regarding the question, I believe you're talking about the China Watch, which is more or less declined by different media. Recently, The Guardian published an investigation, and they mentioned a figure of 13 million circulation worldwide in different media. So that's really very powerful, and this is not only tourism information on China, that kind of thing you sometimes find in the newspapers for a national day of a specific country. This is very dangerous information. One example, after the APEC summit, which was somehow a failure, there were a lot of problems involving China. If you read the China Watch, you will find a nice speech by Xi Jinping, and that's it. So that's journalism, how you find it in the China Watch. That's very dangerous.
Any final thoughts or comments from? Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to our speakers. And be sure to look out for the RSF report, which comes out Monday at 1 p.m. Check with Cedric if you'd like to get an embargoed copy beforehand. And the FCCC report is available on their website. What's the address again?
It's fccchina.org. It's also, I think it's actually probably easier to find on our Twitter feed as well. It's pinned to the top of our Twitter feed, so if you just search us on Twitter.
And the FCC in Hong Kong has shared it as well. Right. All right, thank you very much. And we also have gifts for you guys, some FCC swag.
Thanks, Jen.